The auctioneer hadn't even finished his sentence before the laughter started. It rolled through the crowd like a wave, slow at first, then louder, then the kind of laughter that fills a building and bounces off the rafters. 60, maybe 70 men packed into the Dunmore County Works yard on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of men who'd been coming to these municipal surplus auctions for 20 years and knew exactly what everything was worth. And what everything wasn't worth. What wasn't worth anything, apparently, was Lot 34, a rusted iron lockbox, salvaged from the ruins of the Carlton Grain Exchange after the fire of 2007. 17 years it had sat in a county storage unit off Highway 9, cataloged, forgotten, recatalogued, forgotten again. The kind of thing that ends up on an auction sheet not because anyone thinks it'll sell, but because the county needs to clear the unit, and someone has to pretend there's a process. Caleb Osei was 22 years old. He was standing near the back wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big that had belonged to his father, and he had $120 in his wallet. Every dollar he'd saved from 3 months of weekend shifts at a lumber yard in Dunmore. He had not come to bid on anything else. He had come for that box. The auctioneer, a heavyset man named Roy Stiller, who'd been running these auctions since before Caleb was born, held up his clipboard and squinted. Lot 34. Iron strongbox, Carlton Exchange provenance. Fire damaged, lock mechanism unknown status, contents unknown. He paused. We'll start at $20. Nobody moved. Roy tried again. $10. Somebody take it for 10. That's when the man in the front row, Dale Coburn, who owned the biggest equipment rental outfit in the county and came to these auctions mostly to buy things cheaply and resell them to the township, leaned over to the man beside him and said something. The man beside him laughed. Then the man beside him laughed. Then Roy Stiller himself smiled in a way he probably didn't mean to show. Caleb raised his hand. $60. The laughter stopped being polite. Someone near the side wall said, loud enough to carry, "Son, that thing's not worth the rust on it." Another voice, "Where does a kid like that get $60? And then from Dale Coburn, not cruelly exactly, but not kindly either, just plainly, the way a man states a fact he considers obvious. "Boy, that box hasn't been opened in 17 years. There's nothing in it. The fire burned through everything." Caleb didn't censor. He kept his hand up. Roy Stiller looked at him for a moment, looked around the room, and did his job. $60. Do I hear 65? Silence. Going once at 60. Going twice, 65. That was a younger guy near the door, grinning, clearly testing whether Caleb would fold. Caleb didn't fold. 80. The room shifted. The laughter had moved into something different, not exactly mockery anymore. More like the particular attention people give to a scene that's about to go badly for someone they've already decided can't win. 90, the younger guy said, still grinning. Caleb looked at his wallet in his head. $120. He thought about what he knew. He thought about his father. 100. The young guy shrugged and stepped back. The bid was over. Roy Stiller brought the gavel down. Sold for $100. On the way out, Dale Coburn clapped him on the shoulder. Not unkindly, which was almost worse. "Kid," he said, "I've been coming here 15 years. That box is empty. Always has been." County inspector looked at it in 2009, wrote it off as structural loss. "You just paid $100 for a paperweight." He said it the way adults say things to young people when they've already decided the young person doesn't know anything yet. Caleb thanked him for the advice. He loaded the box into the back of his truck himself. It weighed more than he expected. 60, maybe 70 pounds of iron that had been through a fire and 17 winters, and nobody had cared about for a generation. He drove it home to the garage of the small house he rented on Birchfield Road, and he sat with it under a single work light, and he did not try to open it that night. He'd waited this long. He could wait a little longer to do it right. His father's name was Caleb Osei. Caleb had worked for 12 years as a licensed grain broker, one of only a handful of black brokers operating independently in the province during the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the only one in Dunmore County. He'd built his practice slowly, carefully, the way a man builds something when he knows he can't afford to stumble, representing small and mid-sized family farms on grain futures contracts, helping them protect their margins when commodity prices swung. He was good at it. He was very good at it, actually, and that's the part that mattered. The Carlton Grain Exchange had been the center of the county's agricultural economy for decades. A private exchange house where local brokers placed and cleared contracts. Owen Carlton, the third-generation owner, ran it the way his grandfather had, with the assumption that it belonged to certain people and not others, and that the natural order of the thing was something like fixed. Kwame had not agreed with that assumption, and in the spring of 2006, he had begun to document what he believed was a systematic practice of front-running on client orders, trades that were being placed on inside information, milliseconds ahead of client contracts, skimming fractions of cents per bushel that added up, over thousands of transactions, to hundreds of thousands of dollars in diverted profit. Not his profit, his client's profit. He'd kept records. He kept everything in a lockbox in his office at the exchange, not because he was paranoid, but because he was thorough. It's what made him good at his job. Copies of contract confirmations, trade timestamps, a running ledger with annotations in his handwriting, a formal letter addressed to the Provincial Securities Commission, dated March 14, 2007, that he had not yet sent because he wanted the package to be complete before he filed. On April 3, 2007, the Carlton Grain Exchange caught fire. The fire marshal's report cited an electrical fault in the second-floor offices. The building burned to the structure. 3 people were treated for smoke inhalation. Everyone got out. The lockbox was recovered from the debris and cataloged by the county as part of the asset seizure that followed the exchange's insolvency. Owen Carlton relocated to British Columbia within the month. The investigation into the exchange's practices was opened, reviewed, and quietly closed 18 months later with a finding of insufficient evidence. Kwame Osei died of a heart attack in November of 2009, 2 months after Caleb turned 14. He died with his name attached to a regulatory complaint that had gone nowhere, and with a reputation in the county that had, through a process so gradual and distributed that no single person could be blamed for it, quietly shifted from successful independent broker to the guy who made accusations he couldn't back up. Caleb had been 20 years old before he understood clearly enough to be angry about it. He'd been 22 before he figured out about the lockbox. He found out the way you find out things in small counties, through a conversation he wasn't supposed to be part of. He'd been helping a retired grain farmer named Harold Fitch clear out a storage shed. Harold was in his mid-70s and had known Kwame slightly, the way people in rural counties know everyone slightly. Harold had mentioned, without particular drama, that he seemed to recall the county had pulled a strongbox out of the exchange ruins years ago. And he was pretty sure he'd heard someone say it had Kwame's name on it somewhere in the paperwork. Caleb had driven directly to the county records office the next morning. It took him 3 visits and 2 Freedom of Information requests over 6 weeks to confirm it. The box existed. It was in surplus storage. It had been there since 2008 when the seized assets were transferred. Nobody had opened it because the lock mechanism was fused, and the county appraiser had noted no visible value. Structural damage likely total. Recommend auction disposal. Recommend auction disposal. Caleb had found out about the October auction through a notice in the municipal listings. He'd set his alarm for 5 in the morning that day and driven 40 minutes to be there by 8. He'd stood at the back and watched Roy Stiller hold up Lot 34 and watched 60 men decide in 10 seconds that it was worthless, and he had raised his hand anyway. He'd paid $100. He had $20 left. The lock was a Boswick & Sons No. 7. A heavy-duty commercial mechanism that had been considered extremely reliable in the 1980s and 90s. The fire had warped the facing plate and seized the dial housing, which is why the county appraiser had concluded it couldn't be opened without destroying the contents. What the appraiser hadn't known or hadn't considered was that the Boswick No. 7 had a secondary release built into the lower hinge assembly. a redundancy feature that Boswick had included in commercial units manufactured before 1994, designed for exactly the scenario where the primary mechanism failed. Caleb knew this because he'd spent 4 months researching it. He wasn't a locksmith. He was a guy who had worked lumber yards and landscaping crews, and one winter season doing inventory at a cold storage facility, and who had, in parallel with all of that, spent every spare hour he had learning about the specific type of lock that would have been installed in a grain exchange office in the mid-1990s. He'd found a Boswick service manual through an archived trade publication database. He'd watched every video he could find. He'd ordered a non-fire damaged number 7 from an estate sale in Manitoba and practiced on it for 6 weeks until he could find the secondary release in under a minute. The fire-damaged one took him 4 hours. The garage was cold. He'd set up the work light and a space heater and a thermos of coffee, and he worked in silence, methodically, because his father had taught him that the difference between people who finish things and people who don't is usually just patience. The dial wouldn't turn. The facing plate had fused slightly to the body. He worked the lower hinge assembly with a probe and a tension bar, feeling for the release point the same way you feel for something in the dark. Not by looking, but by learning the shape of the resistance. At 2:14 in the morning, there was a sound. Not a loud sound. A small internal sound, the kind a mechanism makes when something that has been held in one position for 17 years finally moves. Caleb set down the probe. He gripped the handle with both hands. He pulled. The door opened. There was a smell first, old paper and iron and something faintly chemical, the trace of fire that had never fully left. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw what was inside. A red folder, its edges scorched but its contents protected by the iron body of the box. A USB drive in a sealed plastic case. A padded envelope marked Provincial Securities Commission, Confidential Submission. And, in a smaller envelope, unsealed, his name. Not Caleb, he hadn't been born yet. But his father's handwriting, which he recognized immediately, writing for my family in the careful, even letters of a man who wrote the same way he did everything else. He sat on the garage floor for a long time before he opened anything. The red folder held what he had believed might be there. Contract logs, time-stamped trade records, a handwritten ledger covering 16 months of annotated transaction data. Page after page of documentation in his father's precise hand, the kind of record-keeping that had made Caleb Osei good at his job and had apparently, in the end, made him dangerous to people who preferred that certain records not exist. The USB drive, when he opened it on his laptop the next morning after 4 hours of sleep, contained scanned copies of everything in the folder, along with a directory of correspondence. Emails printed and scanned, letters. One internal memorandum from the exchange that his father had somehow obtained, in which Owen Carlton discussed, in terms that were not quite explicit but were not quite deniable either, the practice of timing adjustments on large client orders. The letter to the Provincial Securities Commission had been written with the careful, formal language of a man who knew exactly what he was submitting and why. It listed specific transactions, specific dates, specific amounts. It named Owen Carlton and 2 other principals of the exchange by name. It had never been sent. The personal letter was shorter. His father had written it, Caleb understood, as a man who knew he was about to do something that might cost him everything, and wanted his family to know why. He'd written about his clients, the farmers whose margins he'd been protecting, whose money he'd watched disappear into a mechanism they hadn't known existed. He'd written about what he believed the profession required of a person, and near the end, in the only place where the formal voice broke down, he'd written, "I need you both to know that I tried to do what was right with what I had. Whatever happens, that's the truth of it." Caleb put the letter down and sat at his kitchen table for a very long time. He didn't make any sudden moves. That was the thing people would later get wrong about what happened next. They'd assume it had been a dramatic moment, that he'd called someone immediately, that there'd been a confrontation or a scene. There wasn't. Caleb had grown up watching what happened when people made sudden moves without being prepared. And he'd watched what happened to his father's reputation over 15 years of gradual, quiet revision. and he understood that the way to undo something like that was not with noise. He spent 3 weeks organizing the materials. He scanned every page of the folder and cross-referenced the documentation against public records of exchange transactions from the period. Records that were technically accessible through provincial agricultural archives, but that nobody had ever thought to correlate against individual broker-client logs. He found a lawyer in Toronto, a woman named Claire Ochterberg, who specialized in securities litigation and had taken 2 prior cases involving market manipulation in regional exchanges. He sent her a preliminary summary and the scanned package. She called him back within 48 hours. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Municipal surplus auction," he said. "I paid $100 for it." There was a brief silence. "How old are you?" 22, another silence. Then, "Mr. Osei, I need you to send me the originals. Overnight courier, insured. Don't make any copies you haven't already made. Don't discuss this with anyone in Dunmore County, and call me back tomorrow morning." He did all 3 of those things. Owen Carleton had retired to a small property outside of Kelowna. He was 71 years old and had not thought about the Carleton Grain Exchange in, by his own later account, many years. He received a letter from a Toronto law firm in December, referencing documents recovered from the original exchange premises and inviting him to respond before the firm submitted a formal regulatory complaint. He contacted a lawyer the same afternoon. What followed was not fast. Legal processes in securities matters rarely are, and Claire Ochterberg had explained this to Caleb with the calm specificity of someone who needed him to be prepared for the long version. There were months of correspondence, a regulatory review, a period during which Caleb went back to working lumberyard shifts and kept his phone charged and tried not to let himself believe too much in any particular outcome. Dale Coburn heard about it in February, through the county grapevine that carries information in small places, whether or not you want it to travel. He drove out to Birchfield Road on a Thursday evening and knocked on Caleb's door, and when Caleb opened it, Dale Coburn stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "I heard what you found in that box." "Yes," Caleb said. "Your father had all that in there the whole time." "Yes." Dale Coburn was quiet for a moment. He was not a bad man. Caleb had understood this even at the auction. He was a man who had accepted the county's version of things because it was the version that had been available to him, and who was now standing on a porch having a different version offered to him. "I didn't know," Dale said, "about any of it. I want you to know that." "I know," Caleb said, and he did know. That was the hardest part. In a way, not that anyone had been deliberately cruel, but that the machine of small assumptions and quiet revisions had operated so smoothly that nobody had needed to be. The regulatory panel issued its findings the following autumn. Owen Carleton and 1 other former principal of the exchange were found to have engaged in conduct inconsistent with provincial securities regulations, resulting in the improper diversion of funds from client accounts over a period of approximately 14 months. The financial penalties were significant. The findings were published. Kwame Osei's name appeared in the official record as the individual who had documented and intended to report the misconduct. His complaint, the panel noted, would almost certainly have been sufficient to trigger the original investigation had it been received. Claire Ochterberg called Caleb the morning the findings were released. "It's done," she said. He thanked her. He sat in his kitchen for a while. Then he drove out to the cemetery on the east side of Dunmore and stood at his father's headstone for a long time without saying anything. Because there are things that don't need to be said out loud to be said. The lockbox sits on a shelf in Caleb's apartment now. He moved to a larger place in Dunmore after the civil settlement that followed the regulatory findings, a settlement that won't be detailed here because it's private and because the money, while meaningful, was never the point. The box is empty now. Everything that was in it has been scanned and documented and submitted and returned and filed, and the box itself is just iron and rust and a door that opens. He keeps it because his father bought it in 1993 for his first professional office, paid $60 for it at a used office supply sale, which Caleb discovered from a receipt tucked into the back of the red folder. He keeps it because it is one of the few things his father ever owned that is still exactly what it always was. Some things hold, some things wait, and sometimes the people who laugh at what they don't understand live long enough to read the findings. That's not a comfort or a lesson. It's just what happened.